So mental health is a global crisis, and it's predicted by the World Health Organization to be the leading cause of disease by 2030. So how many years is that? In a few short years, mental illness could be the leading cause of disease. And that's not surprising considering that already mental illness is driving all of the leading causes of death: cardiovascular disease, suicide, COVID-19, diabetes, et cetera. So already stress, anxiety, depression contribute to disease state. Our health is determined by our genetics and our environment. So our environment can include things like diet, exercise, toxin exposure, lifestyle, et cetera. And one thing that makes me feel excited and hopeful is that the effect of our environment on our biology depends on what we're thinking and believing about our environment. So if I'm in this room with you, then I could have the thought, you're interested to hear what I have to say. And that would be maybe a neutral thought, a neutral belief, and it would be neutrally represented in the brain. And so, you have your environment, that's the blue box, and then the green is if you have a neutral belief about your environment. Or I could think, you hate this talk, I'm giving a bad example, the slide says my boss, but now I'm speaking about us here, maybe it's confusing. So that's a threat belief. You don't like me. And now all of a sudden, even just thinking about it and sharing the example, I can feel my heart rate is accelerating. My breathing is changing. And what's going on behind the scenes is that you have activation of regions of the brain like the anterior insula, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. You have activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the HPA axis, that are driving production of signaling molecules such as cortisol, norepinephrine, et cetera, insulin, and these all go and have downstream effects in the body. So just based on what I'm thinking and believing in this moment, I can directly impact my physiology. And that can also impact, for example, production of inflammatory cytokines in inflammatory states. So as Dr. George Slavich shared with us earlier, even just feeling stressed for 10 minutes can dramatically change your inflammatory state, at least in the oral container. We researched this method that's called inquiry-based stress reduction, and this method is a powerful way to change the way that you're thinking and believing. So the question is, if our thoughts are so powerful and our thoughts are driving our biology and changing, our real-time physiology in the moment, and then, downstream causing chronic disease, inflammation, et cetera, how can we actually change those thoughts so that we can use that as a powerful lever to activate our health? So this is one method. It's called inquiry-based stress reduction. And interestingly, it's very similar in how it works as to what Dr. Nolan Williams was describing around ibogaine. So he said, you have a third-party view on your traumatic past. So that's the same thing here, but it doesn't involve any drugs. So what happens is that you notice what you're thinking and believing, and you write it down. So I'm thinking, believing that this talk is going too slow. So I could write it down. Okay. And then you can question that, and it consists of 4 questions. Is it true? Yes. Can I absolutely know it's true that this talk is going too slow? No. And then you witness, how do you react when you believe the thought, and who would you be without the thought? And you can do this for events that were in the past, similar to ibogaine. So now you're taking a third-party witness where you're taking your memory, you're bringing it forward, and you're actually changing the memory, because what happens is that you realize that what you think happened didn't happen, and you also realize what was the role of what I was thinking and believing in my suffering. So if I'm with my friend and I think she's ignoring me, in the moment, I might think that that was due to her, but once I come back and reflect, what I can see is that my belief that she was ignoring me caused a lot of my own suffering. And the other thing that I can see is how did I treat her when I believed that she was ignoring me? What did I do? And maybe I was mean to her, maybe I was cold, and then maybe she did start to ignore me, right? Okay, so this is the method. And there have been a ton of studies on this, over 20 studies, 30 researchers, 7 countries, and they've all shown meaningful changes in psychosocial health. We did a study profiling 47 people across a 9-day immersive intervention, and we measured millions of data points. So we took blood, we took psychometrics, we took stool, and then we did the full multi-omics, measured lots and lots of stuff. We found that 91% of our participants recovered from depression in 9 days, and that effect lasted for 14 months. So that's really, really powerful. Just to give you as a point of comparison, in antidepressant drugs, this is actually a different way to look at it, but in antidepressant drugs, about 30% of people get better. And then here, this is looking at percentage symptom reduction. So all the bars on the left are studies of either antidepressants or different forms of therapy, et cetera. And you can see that the percentage symptom reduction in depression score is about 55%, whereas we saw, I believe we saw an 86% symptom reduction. But there's different ways to look at it. And so this is also twice as effective, basically, as psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy as well. I know it's a little confusing, because 86% reduction in the score, and then 91% of people who cross the threshold from being depressed by their depression score to not being depressed. In addition, we saw gigantic and lasting improvements in anxiety, stress, loneliness, life satisfaction, hope, and meaning. And we had a really high study retention. So at the 14-month mark, it's hard to read this, but almost every single participant was either practicing this still in their life, daily, weekly, or sometimes, which is extraordinarily high for an intervention. Another thing that we saw in our biological data was decreased inflammatory gene expression. And again, these were results that were lasting. So inflammatory gene expression goes down, and then it stays down for several months. And that was also true of the antiviral gene panel as well. A second study that we did in a similar domain was looking at a 6-day immersive retreat of a fully different approach called Date with Destiny. And this is kind of the hodgepodge of psychosocial interventions. So basically, it just takes everything that is known to work for depression, anxiety, and well-being, and just puts it together in 6 days, 100 hours of treatment. That's like 2 years of therapy. So they do meditation, they do gratitude, they do community connection, they do cognitive reframing, they do journaling, they do goal setting, value reframing, everything. And here we did a randomized controlled trial. The control was gratitude journaling, which is an active control. What we saw is that 79% of depressed participants had a depression score below the threshold for depression at 1 week, immediately post the intervention. And by 1 month after the intervention, 100% of participants had a depression score were no longer depressed. 100% of participants had recovered. And that one, we don't have the longer-term data, but Ziv, who spoke earlier, is doing a follow-up study now that he's tracking people over a year. Again, we saw improvements in other psychosocial traits. So why does all of this matter, not just for our mental health, but also for our physical health? Because social connection is the #1 predictor of longevity. It's not whether you smoke, it's not your diet, it's not if you sit at home and watch TV all day and eat junk food. It's none of that. It's not if you exercise. It is the quality of your social connections. And there's been some data to show that relationships can slow aging. So our minds are aging us. We know that stress accelerates epigenetic aging. We know that depression can lead to mitochondrial dysfunction, inflammation, and cellular senescence. And we also know that people who experience trauma, high levels of the trauma that Dr. Ramos spoke about, have a 20-year reduced lifespan on average, which is really high. So, it's very clear that trauma, stress, and relationships are extraordinarily important for our health and our longevity. Still, we don't know, how psychosocial factors actually drive these, despite it being, such an important predictor. So how can we access this huge potential, this huge lever that is so important for our longevity? So potentially through some of these approaches like digital mental health, psychedelics, awareness practices, therapy, et cetera. And so for the first study that I shared with you, and then there's also this study here by David Spiegel showing that among people who had metastatic breast cancer, psychotherapy and self-hypnosis was actually able to extend lifespan by 18 and a half months, which is really incredible. And then Manny Feria, who's an undergraduate in our lab, spearheaded adding to our multi-omics study, looking at a predictor of biological aging. And we used this measure called RNA age calc, which is not as great as epigenetic aging, but it's a proxy measure for biological aging using RNA. And what we saw is that among participants who had this accelerated biological aging phenotype at the start of the study, so we got rid of everyone except for people who had accelerated aging, and what we saw is that among those participants, they had a rapid deceleration of their aging within this 9-day period. And for depressed participants who started with accelerated biological aging, they had an even more dramatic effect. And it's a small sample size, so it's more like a pilot study. And I hope that next we can get the actual epigenetic aging. However, to me, this suggests that we can actually reverse biological aging through psychosocial interventions, which is, again, is not surprising given that psychosocial factors are the #1 predictor of longevity. So I'll just leave you with this. The future of mental health is connection, and I hope that we can all expand our connection with each other today and tomorrow at the Salesforce Tower. And so please, if you haven't already registered, it's going to be a really special day tomorrow. We have Niku Sidarit, who's a high school student who's going to be leading a workshop on youth mental health. She started an entire organization offering resources to high schoolers that's reached thousands of students. We have many of the speakers from today are leading hour-long talks to go a bit deeper into what they did. We'll have meditation, breath work. So if you liked the breath work this morning, we'll have an entire hour of breath work twice. And we'll have singing, again with Chris Pan from My Intent. We'll have James Doty back to speak about compassion and his digital health and generative AI app. We'll have Dr. George Slavich back to speak about the mind-body connection, et cetera. So I'm very excited, and I hope you'll all join us, and please email me tonight or sign up. And so thank you to everyone who worked on these studies. Thank you in particular for this event and for this research to Mike, my advisor. He's the most open-minded, I think I already said this, scientist I've ever met, so I'm very grateful to get to be here and grateful to be in your lab. Thank you. Any questions?
based off of Byron Katie's work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's super cool.
I should have mentioned that, yes. So
Yeah.
it's the work of Byron Katie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it true? Is it? Yeah. That's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and another thing, just like a fun fact, we did a smaller not study where a high school student for her high school project had 10 high school students just for 10 minutes a day go to this website 10 minutes a day for 10 days, and they had a 40% reduction in anxiety, even though some of them started with zero anxiety. It wasn't like a very official study. But what was so interesting to me is that in the same way that we had this super high retention where people who did it were still doing it 14 months later, every single high school student out of those 10 students said that they would do it again, either in general or if they felt really stressed. And I think that the reason for that is because it's so powerful and so effective. So even, personally, I don't always love sitting down to do that practice. However, what I notice is that when I'm truly suffering, then I do it. Yeah.
Also, I think another detail from that that's really important is that once people learned it once, it stuck with them basically for the rest of their lives. One more question?
I think we're all ready to go home.
Yeah, I think everyone's like, yeah, where do we eat? Great. Any final words to wrap?
Maybe a thank you from Mike. Just bring the mic over here.
Right. Mike, you want to give the final words? Here.
Thank you.
Awesome day. Go home.